Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. I do hope you're doing well. I'm doing great, so much better after my bout of flu. It's funny, but when you've had flu, it can go on. Even if you're totally healed, you can still not feel 100% until a few weeks later. And luckily I'm feeling 100% now. But it was a process, and I hope all of you are keeping well and keeping strong and making sure that you don't get any flu, because at the change of season it so easily can happen to us. So before we continue with our story tonight, which you're going to love, at first it's based in Ireland, but it leads to America, so I think you're going to enjoy that, a nice change of scene for you. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, it had indeed been the hardest decision of my entire life. When years ago I had given up my baby for adoption, but sometimes you do what you have to do, to make the very best of a bad situation. And at the time I thought I was doing the right thing, but it was a chagrin decision that I would ultimately live to regret. I had no way of knowing. It would not only rip my life apart, like a ladder tearing through a pair of hose, that would ultimately cause a domino effect in my life, where the quintessential love of my life, Fabian, would be taken from me in bizarre circumstances, and I would ultimately come very close to losing my own life, as one decision that I had made about putting up my baby girl for adoption would have long-lasting repercussions on my life. Who would ever imagine that a lamentable act of great kindness and sacrifice would actually have a boomerang effect in my own life? I had heard my baby was being adopted by a nice American couple with Irish lineage, who were desirous to adopt a child with Irish descendancy. I had not been told much about the American couple, only that they were currently living in Ireland for a year or so, but would soon be returning to their homeland in due course. The couple were from Back Bay, which was a leafy green, tree-lined upmarket neighborhood in Boston, in Massachusetts, and they were exceedingly wealthy, living in an opulent brownstone apartment. I think when I learnt my child would never want for anything in her life, and grow up in the land of the great and the free, which is what so many Irish people like myself considered America to be at that time, I thought my little girl would grow up with her life wrapped in clover, and the thought of that made the thought of parting with her a whole lot sweeter and more bearable. Ireland had always had an intimate connection with the Americas, as after the potato famine in 1845, many of the Irish emigrated to America, and some of my very own relatives had left Ireland during that turbulent time in our history. Much of the Irish celebrate hugely in America when St. Patrick's Day rolls around again, on the calendar of remembrance. It would seem these Irish descendants never want to forget their roots, and who can blame them for that? It is always good, I believe, to never ever forget where you came from. So St. Patrick's Day has always been the quintessential opportunity to celebrate one's Irish lineage. I was happy that my soon-to-be-born baby girl would be adopted by this American couple, who I understood from the adoption agency had struggled tirelessly for over 8 years to get pregnant, and at the time the woman who was eager to adopt my baby had experienced over 8 miscarriages, and the pregnancy seemed to have abruptly ended before the 3rd month, just when the woman was beginning to show, which must, I thought, have been completely devastating for the expectant mother. No sooner had she announced to friends and family that she was expecting a baby, days later the baby was surely lost. The gynecologist could not understand what was going on with the woman, as tests confirmed that she was perfectly fine, but it seemed that her body had chosen to cruelly reject every single pregnancy, for no medically sound reason at all, almost as if the baby was a virus that her body was determined to defeat, which is something that can happen to women who are rhesus A negative. But luckily there is an injection you can have to prevent miscarriages with rhesus A negative blood. But this woman was an enigma, as nothing like this appeared to be going on with her. She was of the O positive blood group. The gynecologist had advised the woman to get a surrogate mother for her, to bring her baby into the world. The couple had been very enthusiastic about this, and heeded his advice, which had ended up badly, as the surrogate mother had refused to part with the baby once it had been born, and the American couple had been demolished to experience another heartbreaking loss like this. When I heard their very sad story, it almost certainly pulled at my heartstrings. I couldn't help but feel desperately sorry for the couple. They had put their hopes in a baby that was cruelly snatched away from them, much like all the miscarriages the woman had endured over and over again, and nobody deserves that. I had been determined to give up my baby after it was born. After having fiercely persuaded my boyfriend Fabian, it was the right thing for us to do, and was in the best interests of our baby. Fabian was not keen on us giving our baby away, but finally he could see sense when he realized we were not in the financial position to offer our baby the best possible start in life. In hindsight, I would live to regret that decision very much. I imagine every single year all around the world there are women like myself that are forced to make similar decisions for the greater good of their babies. As you can imagine, this young American couple, looking to adopt my baby, wanted assurances from me, through the adoption agency of course, that my baby would be theirs, so that they wouldn't be subject to further disappointment and have me change my mind at the very last minute about my baby and deliver them another crushing blow. I was not allowed to meet the people who would adopt my baby, and the information the agency gave me at the best of times was extremely vague, but was enough information to assure me that my baby would be brought up by a loving family who would provide for my child an enviable lifestyle that some people could only ever dream of. Under the circumstances, I had agreed to offer the American couple assurances legally, but I did insist that if my daughter should want to look me up one day, I would welcome her to do that. I wanted her to know that I would love to reconnect with her, should she wish to contact me. I'd even written her a letter for the couple to give her when she was old enough to read it. I wanted my little girl to know that for me and her father, giving her up was the hardest decision that we had made in our lives, but we had tried to put her interests before our own. I was happy about the American couple adopting my baby. I wanted my child to enjoy the unblemished promises of a bright future with a great education and plenty of opportunities that would lightly drop out of the sky for her, rather like manna from heaven. And who wouldn't want that for their child? I had never known the benefits of financial freedom in my own life, as growing up both my parents had struggled financially to break even. I do remember from month to month my mother would quite literally count pennies, so yes, it really was that bad. My mother had been a cook and a housekeeper for a well-to-do rich Irish family in Galway, called the Sandersons. My father had been the groundskeeper for the Sandersons family, managing the large rolling grounds of their grandiose property that had been in the family for generations. The Sandersons lived in an old, very dreamy-looking romantic castle that these days every aspiring bride would probably love to hire for a wedding venue. The Sandersons who owned the castle and employed my parents as staff were far from generous when it came to administering their wages. They were from old money, you see, and I think to be fair on them, and to give them the benefit of the doubt, they were completely out of touch with how expensive things had become for the middle and working classes in the 21st century. I guess they lived in their own very well-upholstered, misinformed bubble, as if they were caught up in some 1940s time warp, rather like the characters in Downton Abbey. And believe it or not, families like this do still exist, as hard as that might be to believe, especially in some parts of the United Kingdom, Scotland and Ireland. Life had been hard on the financial front for my family, but growing up me and my brother Gabriel had very little to complain about, for we wanted for nothing. There was an abundance of love in our household. My family lived in a charming whitewashed cottage on the grounds of this grandiose estate, surrounded by dramatically breathtaking scenery that would steal your breath away, which included rugged cliffs that overlooked the coast. So me and my brother Gabriel were securely cushioned by the pomp and ceremony of the natural world. We grew up exploring the craggy caves and the cliffs on the coast, and having the kind of childhood that even the rich would probably dream about, as money can't always buy everything. My parents were rigidly strict Catholics. They didn't believe a couple should live together before they got married, and much like myself, they considered it morally wrong to abort a child. I'd always agreed with their manner of thinking in this regard. I know it's a highly contentious matter for many. For me, it was not just from the Church's religious teachings that had persuaded me against abortion, but I do remember vividly when I was a little girl at school. The school invited a prominent gynecologist to talk to all the pupils. This man had been an atheist who never believed there was a God, and had physically performed thousands and thousands of abortions on unborn babies, until he could do it no longer. He claimed he had killed more babies than some of the most prominent serial killers in our history. He told us the babies, even in the early stages of pregnancy, physically felt pain, no matter how small they actually were. And he went on to describe how they cried out in agony when he vacuum suctioned them out of the woman's body. When he told us this, he physically began to cry and wince at his recall, as if the memories of what he'd done during these abortion procedures had all but broken his heart. He said every time he performed a procedure, he was riddled with guilt that hung over him like a dark cloud. He was hit with the profound sense that he was doing something that was wrong, like an inner knowing of some kind. One day in his sleep, he claimed to have heard the voice of God saying that the blood of the children he had killed was on his own hands, and he needed to stop the abomination and slaughter to save his soul. He was told that he needed to speak up about this matter so that women everywhere would know the truth about abortion, and that this was not about their body, but the child that was growing inside of them. After his encounter with God, this prominent gynecologist became a believer. He repented fiercely and refused to perform any abortions. He has since been on a mission to persuade young women to bring their babies to full term and finally have them adopted if they feel unable to care for the child themselves. I think that this story resonated with me in some way, and all the other girls in my class as well. We did all weep with this gynecologist when he told us of his experience. I won't go into more graphic detail of some of the horrifying tales he shared with us, but no one who listened to this man's speech would ever choose to willingly have an abortion after listening to him, as it completely changed our perspective in regards to the matter. My mother was a well-upholstered, buxom woman, with a round, friendly, endearing face, rosy cheeks, and very clear porcelain skin that was completely devoid of all wrinkles. Let's just say everyone was very complimentary of how beautiful my mother's skin was. But I think her quintessential secret lay in her physical plumpness that seemed to keep her wrinkles at bay, making my mother look younger than her years. I rather suspect if she lost the weight, her skin would also lose its beautiful luminosity. My mother was jovial, a jolly domesticated woman, with a warm heart and a grand sense of humour. She had what I would describe as a light-hearted, easy-going, carefree approach to life, but was fiercely insistent about her strict religious beliefs. She didn't want to do anything that might offend God in any way. My father, like my mother, was also a religious man, but he was like a string bean. He had a long angular face, a long body, and no real flesh on his bones to speak of, even though he laboured on the castle grounds for hours on end. But despite his ceaseless physical exertion, he still never developed a large build. My mother described my father as a bottomless pit, because he could eat the turkey off a Christmas table, and all the Christmas pudding, mince pies, and brandy butter besides. But his scrawny body resolutely remained stick-thin, whereas my mother only had to look at a dumpling, and she'd put on a couple of inches in half a second. Well, that is what she would tell anyone who would listen, but I think she was in denial. I secretly suspect my mother was a secret snacker, who got up in the middle of the night to raid the fridge for midnight snacks. I remember once as a girl, I woke up to hear a strange rustling sound coming from the kitchen. I scurried downstairs to find out what was going on. I discovered, to my astonishment, my mother in her nightgown raiding the refrigerator. She was eating a large bowl of chocolate ice cream, in an almost zombie-like state, as if she didn't exactly know what she was doing. When I confronted her the next morning about it, and told her I'd seen her gobbling up the ice cream in the middle of the night, she denied any knowledge of eating that ice cream. "What are you talking about, Fiona? Of course I never raided the fridge last night. You must be mistaken. It was probably in your dream. I think I would know, don't you, if I'd eaten a tub of chocolate ice cream?" To that I had no answer, and I wondered if it was possible to sleepwalk and eat at the same time, with no memory of the event. I'd left home when I was 18 years old, which was the hardest decision I'd ever had to make. I was very close to my parents, you see, and going out into the big bad world was very intimidating. I attended a university in Edinburgh, thanks to the Sandersons, who owned the large estate where my father worked. It would seem they knew names and high places, as people in their positions in high society invariably always do. The Sandersons were able to pull some strings on me and my brother's behalf, so that our university degrees were paid for in full. So we were incredibly fortunate in that regard. The Sandersons even gave us both small allowances, so even though they were out of touch with the cost of living, and paid my parents rather low wages, they had been extremely generous to me and my brother Gabriel, and for that my parents felt extremely indebted to the Sandersons, who believed in further education, and wanted us both to acquire degrees, and to make something of our lives. At the time I fell pregnant, I was sharing a rather higgledy-piggledy basement apartment with 4 other students in Edinburgh. Regretfully, most of the time the place was an absolute mess, as some of the students didn't care to keep it clean. And there were so many bicycles parked outside the apartment, so it could be difficult to walk through the front door at times. I was also working as a waitress part-time to bring in some extra cash, and I only got to see my parents twice a year. At the time I was practically living on baked beans, as being a student I was always broke, which was the case with all my fellow students, who were pretty much in the same boat as I was. Everyone appeared to be poor and broke at the same time, but of course there were exceptions to those rules, and those were the students of affluently wealthy parents, who pretty much gave their children everything, and I would see those students of privilege all over campus. The life I was living in Edinburgh was so far removed from my life that I had spent with my parents and brother Gabriel in our quaint whitewashed cottage in Galway that overlooked the magnificent rugged cliffs and pretty stretches of ocean, along with stone walls, expanses of emerald green grass, and plenty of grazing sheep. If you had stepped foot in my parents' cottage, you might have believed you'd gone back in time to another century, perhaps. Many people visiting Ireland in some pockets of the country will describe some parts of Ireland seem almost to be stuck in a time warp, and they'd be absolutely right about that. I guess you could say I lived a rather old-fashioned lifestyle. My mother regularly made steamed puddings for dessert. There was no fast food in our lives. We lived what I would describe to be a very slow-paced, easy-going way of life, and I liked it that way. Our lives were devoid of stress, where you worried about nothing at all. The things that concerned my mother the most was if there was enough jam for the roly-poly pudding she was serving for the evening meal, or who would help her polish the church's silver for the Sunday morning service. Even though money was tight, we never worried about it at all. We accepted our lot as you do. And sometimes the pastor would give my mother some extra cash for the stuff she did around the church, as I think he sensed the Sandersons didn't pay her terribly well. When I moved to Edinburgh with my brother, I felt as if we'd been thrown from an ancient top-loader washing machine into a state-of-the-art, highly efficient tumble-dryer, as life went by so fast, and Edinburgh was a bustling city with so much going on and so much to do. It possessed a young energy about it, thanks to all the students. I met my boyfriend on the university campus, and I know it sounds desperately unromantic, but it was anything but. The first time I ever saw Fabian was when I was walking across the carpet of green grass at the university campus with my books in hand. I was on my way to a lecture. I noticed a small group of students relaxing under a large oak tree together, basking in the sunshine and happily chatting away. One of the young students, sitting under the large oak tree on the grass, was Fabian himself. He looked at me when I walked past the group, following the long stone pathway through the grass, surrounded by roses on every side, that led straight up to the university red brick corridors. Fabian had seen me before, at a coffee shop in town. He told me there was something so fresh and different about me that had grabbed his immediate attention. He said I reminded him of a wildflower that you discovered growing in a well-tended garden. And when the gardener finds the flower, his first thought is, where did this beautiful, unique flower spring from? I guess what Fabian was really saying was I looked rather like a fish out of water on this university campus, a girl who had not been contaminated by the fashionable dictates of the modern world, which to a degree was absolutely true, given I'd grown up in the countryside and was far from sophisticated. In that moment, Fabian, who by nature was quiet and reticent, he did something incongruously impulsive, as if a spring-like mechanism inside himself had somehow projected him towards me, like a stone in a slingshot. He excused himself from his friends and ran over to me, trying desperately to think of some perfect excuse whereby he could start up a conversation with me. He had no idea what he was going to say, and was not one of those smooth men who had a long list of chat-up lines at his disposal. "Excuse me. So sorry to disturb you. Are you by any chance Lisa Logan? I think you may well be a friend of my sister's. My sister's name is Annie Augustus. I'm sure I've seen you hanging around with her before." "Annie Augustus? I think I'd remember a name like that," I said, pausing for a brief moment, to think if I knew any Annies. But the only Annie I knew was from the movies. "No, I don't even know an Annie," I admitted. "But a name like Annie Augustus, I don't think I'd forget in a hurry." "I suppose not," he said, grinning broadly. His green eyes twinkled with amusement. "So if you haven't been hanging around with my sister, I guess you're not Lisa Logan after all. It's funny, I was sure you were her, but I must be a tad confused. Got my wires crossed, perhaps." "Well, I'm not Lisa Logan," I admitted. "I've never heard of her before a day in my life. I'm sorry you got the wrong person." "I'm not sorry. It's good to meet you," said Fabian, giving me a lopsided smile, which was irresistibly charming, and lit up his green eyes. He reached out to shake my hand warmly and said, "And you are?" "I'm Fiona Waitman." "Fiona? I think that kind of suits you," he said, studying me curiously. "So where are you from, Fiona? My guess is you're not an Edinburgh girl." He shook his dark head of soft curls adamantly. "You're definitely not an Edinburgh girl, that's for sure." "Is it that obvious?" I asked, looking disappointed. "Don't look like that. It's actually a compliment. You look so fresh-faced, unsullied by the sophistication of the world that can harden people, make them aloof and cold. But you're not like that, and it's really good to see. Sophistication is far too overrated, if you ask me. It can be awfully unattractive." "Well, I'm from Galway, if you must know, so I guess I am unsophisticated." "Galway," he said appreciatively. "I love that part of Ireland, along with Cork and Killarney, of course. Tell me, Fiona, do you like pizza?" "Do I like pizza?" I asked, looking at Fabian with a raised brow. "I think that's rather a stupid question, if you don't mind my saying so. I think I'd struggle to find someone who didn't like pizza. If the truth be told, it's one of my favourite foods to eat, which I guess does make me very unsophisticated. I'd love to be able to tell you that I love octopus on a bed of black lentils served with some fancy truffle sauce, but that wouldn't be true." "I'm glad to hear it. Simplicity is the best. And, of course, it's a whole lot easier on the wallet. But you do make a very good point. What right-thinking student would turn their nose up to pizza? Unless, of course, they're a terrible snob, who believe pizza is peasant food. But you don't fit the profile of a condescending girl like that." "Well, I certainly would never turn my nose up to pizza. When you live on baked beans such as I do, pizza is like food from the gods." "Well, I happen to know this awesome Italian restaurant. It's recently opened. It's called Mamma Mia." He smacked his lips, making a kissing gesture that made me smile. "The food there is to die for. I had a pizza there last week with a good friend of mine. I can honestly say, without exaggeration, it was the best pizza I've ever tasted in my entire life. Better than pizza I've had even in Italy. The bases are thin and crisp, The tomato sauce takes a pizza to a whole new level. I'd like to take you there if I may." "Well, if you're intending to pay for our meal, I won't say no to a tempting offer like that. It sounds perfectly lovely." "Of course I'm paying. I wouldn't be asking you out otherwise, would I? I'm very old-fashioned like that. I like to look after the woman I take out, especially someone as lovely as yourself." "Well, I don't know what to say," I said, blushing furiously, my skin suddenly growing terribly hot from the unexpected compliment. I realized that I really did like this young man. Everything about him was extremely attractive, but the best part of him was his personality. He had a great sense of humour. I had not come to Edinburgh to get involved with anyone, but Fabian was not someone I could easily turn my back on. There was something about him that pulled me right in, rather like a fish at the end of a fisherman's line. "Just say yes to me, Fiona," he said pleadingly. "I promise you won't regret your decision. I happen to know that Mamma Mia does the very best tiramisu." "Well, if that's the case, I don't see that I can refuse your invite. I do enjoy a good tiramisu." We took down each other's details as you do, exchanging numbers, and just as he was about to walk away, he suddenly turned around and said, "By the way, Fiona, I've got a confession to make. I'm going to come clean with you. I don't happen to have a sister called Annie, and if Lisa Logan does exist, I've never met her a day in my life. But maybe she is out there. Who knows?" he chuckled. "I just wanted an excuse to talk to you. There is something so beguiling and fresh about you that is different to other girls, and I was afraid if I didn't ask you out right now, I might let a good thing pass me by. And I couldn't let that happen, so I had to be inventive and find the perfect excuse to talk to you." "Lisa Logan doesn't exist?" I asked, looking confounded. "I'm afraid not. It's a tall story. I think my nose is getting very long." "And you don't have a sister called Annie Augustus?" "No, I'm afraid I don't have a sister called Annie Augustus. If it helps, I always wanted a sister, and my parents were hoping to have a girl after I was born. And if their wish had been granted, they would have almost certainly called her Annie. So theoretically, Annie Augustus could have existed." "Do you have any siblings?" I asked. "Yes, I have an older brother called Logan." "No sisters, then?" "Sadly, no. I think having a sister would have been pretty cool, I will admit. Now that I've come clean with you, are you still going to come out with me for pizza?" "But of course. I'm impressed that you made up these fictitious characters to talk to me. It's very inventive and innovative. I think it's cool. It shows you've got a great imagination, and I really like that." That was the beginning of my long-lasting relationship with Fabian, so you can see why I considered our encounter to be rather romantic. I don't even think I remember the taste of the Italian food at Mamma Mia when we went out together for our first date, as there was quite literally sparks flying between us, and the food and its deliciousness seemed of little significance in the circumstances, but I'm sure it tasted very good. Within days, Fabian and I had become inseparable, and he was sharing a room with me at the semi-detached basement apartment I shared with 4 other friends in Edinburgh. Fabian began to contribute to the rent, so he was gladly welcomed into our home by the 4 other students I shared the place with. As the less you have to pay out as a broke student, the fatter your wallet becomes, and no one wants their wallets to lose any weight. That's a waistline that you want to expand exponentially. If my parents had known I was sharing a room with Fabian, they'd have been appalled, but what they failed to know would not hurt them. My mother had always told me never to be intimate with a man before my wedding day, but in this modern generation that we live in, those views are very outdated. My relationship with Fabian blossomed, rather like a cherry tree in spring. When I discovered I was pregnant, I was in a dreadful state. I remember staring at the 2 blue lines on the pregnancy test with the same kind of fear you might feel if the roof was caving in on top of your head and about to fall down upon you. I sat on the knowledge that I was pregnant for many days, like a coffee that is percolating. I had no way of knowing how Fabian would react to the news. I was terrified it would tear our lives apart. I need not have worried. as Fabian, when he heard I was pregnant, was overjoyed at the news, as if he had hit the jackpot and won millions of dollars. He began to pummel the air excitedly with his fists, in a gesture of delight. "You're pregnant?" he asked me, his eyes shining like perfectly polished green marble. I nodded, looking at him with wide, earnest eyes. I really thought he was going to get upset and run his hands through his hair and look at me with worry etched on his face, saying, "What are we going to do? This couldn't come at a worse time, Fee." But he never said that. "Are you sure you're pregnant?" he asked me, his smile growing so wide. I was surprised it actually fit on his face. "It's true," I said. I showed him the 2 lines on my pregnancy test. "I thought we'd been so careful, Fabian, I really did. I don't know how this could have possibly happened. But I can't believe you're not really upset about this." Fabian took me lovingly in his arms. We danced around the floor in glee, doing twists and turns. And for a while I was swept up in the undulating waves of his contagious euphoria. But then reality hit me hard. It would seem days later I tried making Fabian see that having a baby while we were at university was not remotely practical. Neither of us had much money between us. We were both studying to get degrees. We certainly did not have the time nor the money to devote our attention to raising a baby. I knew if my mother knew that I had fallen pregnant as an unmarried woman, she'd have been so desperately disappointed in me. I'd have let her down badly. She would believe her daughter had become a loose woman with the morals of an alley cat. I couldn't have her think of me in that diminishing light. I really couldn't. In truth, I would have liked to have confided in my mother about my plight, but I just couldn't do it. I would later learn that had I shared my dilemma with my mother, she'd have been more than happy to assume the responsibility of caregiver for her grandchild. But pride can set you back to the path of no return, where you'll be cruelly teased by the waves of great regret that would continue to sting my life in the years that were to follow, because I would have so many regrets. "But we must keep our baby," Fabian had insisted. "You're not suggesting you have a termination, are you? You can't do that. This is our baby we're talking about. I refuse to believe our baby is just a bunch of cells growing inside you. I'm sorry, but I've never seen it that way. I know people would disagree with me, but I believe this baby is a gift of God, and we can't abandon it." So there we are. That is the end of part 2 of our story. Part 3 is tomorrow night. I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.